Hi, this is JK here with the Babbers Show, the show for older people by older people on Ujima Radio 98 FM. What we're going to be doing this week is we're going to be discussing grief and bereavement, part of our contribution to Bristol's Healthy City Week. And we have here in the studio two of our guests, which is Mirella and Bob, both experts in the field. And shortly we're going to be joined by Pete and Alan, who are somewhere out there in the traffic. Hopefully we'll be here soon. Mirella and Bob, could you just briefly explain your background as to your region and sector that you are involved with? Mirella, you first?
Oh yes, well I'm from Bristol and District Area Cruise, which is an organisation, a part of the national body Cruise Bereavement Care. I have been a bereavement volunteer with Cruise since about 2001. I have worked with clients and now I do more sort of management roles within the organisation.
That's fantastic. That's a really, really good part of the sector to be in, is the voluntary sector. And you, Bob, what's your background in this?
Well, my background in this area really started with my 11 years as a Samaritan volunteer. I then moved and trained in counselling, and I joined Bristol Drugs Project. And whilst I've been at the project, I've been instrumental in, designing and delivering an older people's service, an age-specific service, which at the time was the first age-specific service of its kind in the country. So yeah, that's my background.
Okay, I've talked to you before, Bob, about this grief and therapy and bereavement and counselling and things like that, and you've said that what you feel is that there should be active support, not just hand-holding. Would you like to explain what you mean by that, please?
Well, I think bereavement and grief is one of those things that many of us are a bit afraid of, and we try our best, and whilst we're well-meaning, we can say some very difficult things or awkward things that are very unhelpful for people. That's often through feeling that we need to say something when often we don't really need to say anything. Just being there and supporting a person who's going through grief and bereavement, it can be good enough.
Yes, I've found that personally, is that on both sides of the coin, I don't know what to say. So I don't say anything, but with my sisters, especially when my mum died, it was more give a hug, hold a hand, go for a quiet walk on a beach. Mirella, is that your attitude as well?
Yes, very much so. I mean, we have examples given to us quite often of clients who will see their neighbours cross the road rather than speak to them, and it's not that they want to be unkind or ignore them or anything. It's just they don't know what to say, and then people come out with rather trite things about, well, give it time and you'll be over it, when really what the client needs or the bereaved person needs is someone just to be there and listen to them, because what most people want to do who've been recently bereaved is talk about the person who's died, talk about the things that they did together and all their sort of joint experiences and just about the person generally, and that is the best way you can help. And also offer practical help if it's appropriate, just to help that person, get through what is obviously a very traumatic time for them, and not put them in a position where they might feel uncomfortable, like sort of perhaps taking them out to a busy restaurant when they're feeling rather delicate and maybe burst into tears any moment. So it's just being thoughtful and being kind.
Yes, we're going to go on to the practicalities of it all in a few minutes. We've just been joined by Pete, who got stuck in traffic and got a little bit delayed, but he's here now. Pete, could you just give a brief background to your experience in grief and bereavement?
Yes, in the group, people often come in feeling that they really don't know how to behave, what to feel. They feel very confused, and I think that's really clear. So many of them say they haven't really had a chance to do anything with their feelings. The problem for many of them is not just the bereavement, but also the stigma of somebody having been bereaved through drugs and alcohol. And society's response to that is the society's response to that is very judgmental. And on top of the normal, I don't know what to say, there's a very different judgmental, I don't know what to say. And people feel they have the same bereavement that anybody else has. They have the same feelings. They might need to express anger in the normal way, but also anger at maybe as a consequence of the person's behaviour and how it's affected them. Often there's been quite long-term problems for the family. People being judgmental about other members of the family, feeling betrayed or let down sometimes. But beyond that is a lot of love. That love never really goes away. And I think the practicalities are people need to hear themselves and others speaking the truth, saying, I love that person and I feel angry. They need to hear themselves saying it and hear other people saying those same things and realising that's normal. That's something that, I mean, one of the things you get from the group is being able to see other people who've moved on. So you do see survival, but it's modelled rather than being told you'll be all right, just give it a bit of time.
That's interesting because you keep talking about a group there.
Yes.
Bob's been talking about the Samaritans, which tends, in my view, I'm not absolutely sure I'm correct here, is that mostly is done by telephone. And Mirella, what do you do? Do you tend to work in groups, by phone or by personal contact?
Well, we offer both one-to-one support and group support. We have a drop-in group at Bristol Cruise, which for some people is just what they need, because they can talk to other people in a similar situation. They can share their experiences, and firm friendships are made because they're in touch with one another during the sessions that we provide. We also provide one-to-one support, face-to-face support, either in our cruise office or, if necessary, we visit people at home. And that's for people who perhaps feel a group isn't for them, and they work with one of our trained bereavement volunteers. And we also support people over the telephone. We have specialist groups as well for people who have been bereaved by suicide, and that is a very special area of our work and needs a lot of expertise to be able to support people.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the suicide side of it, having experienced my father when I was age 13. We might come back to that a little bit later on. Bob, which do you think is better, which in terms of your experience, whether it's personal contact in one-to-one or in a group or via the phone, or which?
I don't think there's one size fits all with this. Everybody's bereavement in loss and grief is different, and they need to work it through their own way. I guess it's about people simply being there and staying with them long enough to recognise what their needs are and to try and meet those needs when at the time of need. And that is, I think, what people find difficult, just sitting there to kind of recognise what the person needs. They feel compelled to kind of step in and intervene in the process, and often they're only meeting their own needs and not the needs of the person going through the bereavement. One thing I wanted to say, JK, is it's been many years since I've been a Samaritan volunteer, and they've moved on. They did do face-to-face and telephone, but now they've moved on in great leaps, and they're doing a lot of online stuff and maybe Skype. So they're a different organisation than I used to belong to.
Yes, I bow to your expertise there, because I'm fortunate to have come from a very large family that of those of us that are in any one particular, continent it is now. When we do have a death in the immediate family, we tend to congregate together and support each other. it tends to be one of the aspects of certain parts of society now are so isolated they don't have that family support. And it might be that they are rejected by their own family, which is why I think I might have turned to you, Pete, there. Is what's your opinion on that, where if you've got the family support, do you just stay with that, or do you go to an expert?
I think both are really important. But often family members and friends perhaps don't know how to respond to the drug and alcohol aspect. They don't understand the complications that often provides. I think what's important is permission to express your feelings. I think being able to talk about memories, being able to talk about the person, and continue to have a relationship with that person. They may be dead, but they're still important to you.
Yes, very succinct sentence there. Okay, welcome back to the Babbers Show. This is JK, and our discussion today is about grief and bereavement, and we have 4 people in the studio as well as myself now. We have Morella that we were talking to before the break. We have Bob, Pete, and now we've been joined by Dr. Alan Kellis. Alan, the others have explained what their background is as to where their interest is in grief and bereavement. Can you just give a brief explanation as to where you come?
Yes. I've been a community psychiatrist helping adults with learning disabilities, particularly children as well a bit. So I've been interested in the course of my professional work how to help people who may be less verbal, less able to express themselves, and I've also got a particular interest in how men deal with grief, and also the power of nature in how maybe nature has a role in helping us through difficult times.
Oh, that's interesting, because you've introduced yet another group into there, which is learning difficulties and those with an inability to speak. We have been talking briefly about whether the best thing is one-to-one, whether it's in a group, or whether it's via telephone, things like that. And in your opinion, working with those special people that do have learning difficulties or maybe are non-verbal, how do you approach it with them, in the group or what?
It's just such an individual thing, isn't it? Some people certainly find groups and communicating in groups very, very difficult. I think what's important is to try to tune into what's important for the person, listen to their own ways of communicating, be open to the possibility that other than words, movement or sound or even making images, any sort of creative material might be useful.
I have noticed that with the advances in modern medicine these days, that you are getting much longer lifetimes with anybody that has these complex issues. Do you find that you're getting this loss of partner without necessarily involving anything like a marriage or anything like that, that it's just a very, very good friend is as important to those people?
Definitely. I think one of the things that I've learnt is that my own judgments about what might be an important loss for someone are much less relevant than what's important for the person. I've certainly had experience of people for whom the loss of a pet, particularly, for example, can be absolutely crucial and quite devastating. The loss of a dreamed future can be an important grief. So I think there are different ways of understanding loss, and it's certainly much bigger than just the loss of one key partner, although obviously that's a very important thing.
And Bob, I know that one of your interests is focusing on the older person in grief here. Do you find that you get the same thing, that you get it, this talking between people of similar backgrounds is important?
Well, I think the talking is important, and I think sharing in a mutual aid sense is very helpful for people where you don't have, let's say, an expert doing it, but somebody who has perhaps shared a similar thing with a minimum of training, so that to make sure they're not saying unhelpful things. But I think that's really good for the person to know that the person they're talking to has experienced something very, very similar to them.
Morella, turning to you on that idea where you said earlier on that you represent crews in Bristol. Within that area, do you have special groups that focus with one particular background of person that's coming in?
Well, we also have groups in North Somerset, but we are in the process of planning a group for older people over 50s. That will sort of start sometime next year, and that will be specifically for the older person, because research has shown that people who are bereaved sort of later in life are often become very isolated and lonely. So sort of bringing people together who have all been, have had bereavements, not necessarily recent, could be some time back, but they will be able to, we hope, sort of support each other and do activities together, and each have an understanding of what the other person may be feeling, and that often is loneliness and isolation following the loss of a partner, because they've been so used to doing things with someone else, sort of socializing with someone else, running the home and doing all that's required around that with another person, and suddenly to be left to cope with it on your own, as well as sort of going through the grief process is very, it's quite devastating for some people.
Yeah, I noticed that with my mother-in-law. When her husband died, her focus as a hobby was all to do with sailing, dinghy sailing. And when he died, there was this thing, oh, well, I'm not a member of the club, I'm not the sailor, I'm not this. And so therefore she definitely isolated herself for quite a long time, almost a year, before she found her interests were strong enough to make her leave the house, in effect. And we were talking earlier on about the loss of somebody, and sometimes you're talking about 30 or 40 years of being your friend as well as your husband or wife or partner. And that type of aspect also comes into the money side and what happens in that first few minutes, days afterwards. Again, talking about the same mother-in-law, very fortunate that he worked for a very, very large company. And the next day, following his death, somebody turned up with the company with a cheque worth his annual salary in advance, just to say, you're okay, you're safe, this is sorted out. But very, very few people these days especially are in that very fortunate position. Alan, do you find that you get that when you're talking as in terms of as a psychiatrist, as you get this issue that other things are coming to the fore, not just the grief?
Definitely. Past griefs can come to the fore, but as you say, just usually, in my experience, grief is associated with reorganising a huge amount, both internally and externally, in anyone's life. So particularly, as you say, the sort of social circumstances so that combination of emotional turmoil and practical chaos can be very, very difficult to unravel, both what needs to be done practically and what needs to be done, what might be helpful emotionally.
And Pete, you were talking about the drugs and alcohol group earlier. Specifically in what I know from my experience here in Bristol as a city, is that those people are actually coming into the service of the drugs and alcohol service isolated in the first place. They haven't got many friends, they haven't got many family that will still talk to them. So you're talking about them not only getting the loss of a new partner or whatever, also their support system is gone.
Yes, I think often people who are bereaved through addiction aren't free to talk about the problems they're experiencing openly with family members or other people. It's because of the shame, because of the stigma that's involved in it. It becomes a major problem, and then when somebody dies, the situation becomes apparent to everybody, or maybe aspects of the situation become apparent to everybody. So suddenly it's exposed at a time when they're more vulnerable than at any other time. So it's a problem which is compounded by the social attitude towards drugs and alcohol specifically, which I suppose the thing that's most important to them at that time is either being able to speak openly about these feelings and these experiences, or hear somebody else express those feelings and experiences for them. And I think that's maybe something that, in group or counselling, that's a very helpful experience to people.
Okay, yes, I think we'll come back to that after the news. And this is JK, and welcome back to the Babbers Show on Ujima Radio 98 FM. Today we've got a whole show about grief, bereavement, coping strategies, therapy and everything else. We've got 4 guests in the studio. And I'm going to take a slightly different twist now. It was mentioned slightly earlier on, is that sometimes when an older person dies, well, nearly always actually, when an older person dies, you're left with a child that's bereaved. Now, I actually lost my father extremely quickly. At the age of 13, I was informed at 6 o'clock in the morning that he had died, whereas I was expecting to go out for a walk with him on the farm. And the other side of it was with my second stepfather at 92, and we were just very, very quietly, all of us waiting together for him to slip away one night, which is what happened. We had lots and lots of warning. But Morella, if I could turn to you first, is how does an adult, maybe a member of the family or yourself as a counsellor, talk to a child that has lost somebody?
Well, obviously it will depend a great deal on the age of the child. We have a service at Cruise for children and young people, and we work with children in a variety of ways. We use practical activities for children to sort of express themselves and sort of say how they're feeling, because younger children are not able to articulate their feelings about their loss. We use story, we use puppets, so the child can use a puppet as maybe the person that they've lost, or any other member of the family where it's that they have quite an influence on the child. But it's the bereavement volunteer who will sort of assess that child, see how they can best help the child, and also then we would talk with the parents and give them guidance of how best way to help a child through their grief. And it may be that with a younger child, in latter years, and they say, sort of, you're talking about maybe a 5-year-old, and then time moves on, and it could be that when they get to teenage or 10, 11, that they will need to revisit that bereavement again and sort of work through it, because their memories may be a bit distorted, or there may be things that they didn't understand at that stage, which now that they have matured a little, they will be better able to understand and talk about.
Bob, do you agree with that on that side?
Yes, I do. I think a younger person, say the age of 12 or 13, losing somebody who's really significant to them, can leave a huge legacy for them later on in life. And as Marilla's just said, sometimes it has to be revisited, and it rather depends on the family dynamic and how it's managed within the family. I know of situations where it was just too painful for anybody to talk about it, and therefore it was never resolved for that young person, which left quite a big legacy for them to try and manage later on. And they had to revisit it in therapy, and they had to get back in touch with the person that was lost and go through the process again at a later stage, to be able to, I don't know whether you resolve these things, but be able to move through them in a healthy way.
Yeah, I very much agree with that, having had myself and 3 sisters that basically didn't talk about it for some 30 odd years. Not in any detail, it's just skipped over, skimmed through, thus not mentioned. Alan, is that your opinion on the same thing? Is that you kind of lock things up for years and years and years, and it's possibly how do you talk to them differently as a child?
Yes, I think we've sort of discussed how individual it is, how also I mean, you were describing how a bereavement can be a sudden thing, so there's shock in there as well, as against a slow process of somehow losing someone. So there are different processes that are bound to happen depending on the nature of what the loss and the grief is. And also, just to echo that idea that it's not necessarily one event, but it can recur. So there's reminders at particular times or in particular places. So grief can catch you in unexpected ways.
Yeah, that's true for a lot of people that I've spoken to, is that there's a huge difference between sudden and planned is the wrong word, except for a few people, but expected. Do you find the same, Pete?
Yes, I think people, particularly with drugs and alcohol, death tends to be very sudden and unexpected and probably premature. So I think people often have to deal with that immediate shock. I think the other thing that can occur, and I suppose this is mainly to parents or partners rather than children, but when the death is being I suppose notified and brought to the, made known to the surviving members of the family, it may also be part of a police investigation or something like that. So the person carrying the news is also performing another role. They're not necessarily, their primary task might be to inform, but it might be to investigate or find out the circumstances of the death. So I think that the shock experience, I think that happens less with the younger people, but I think younger people's needs are often overlooked in these circumstances. And I think that's, I did hear a quote saying, or an individual saying, what happened to one of my friends was somebody said to her, how are your friends taking it? So ignoring her experience of bereavement, thinking only about the parents. I don't quite know how that happens, but it does happen, and there is a wide and untalked about experience of that. I think there are some guidelines that have now been produced around bereavement through addiction, which I will give you the details of if people want to refer to them. So it's about those guidelines about how we as professionals work with individuals who have been bereaved through drugs and alcohol or addiction or addictive behaviours.
I think actually you touched on something quite interesting there briefly, is that this age thing is that often with drugs and alcohol, it's actually a child that you've lost, which those of us that have advancing years like myself is more likely to happen, is that you've got an adult child that you're losing. And there's not as yet in this society too many people that are under 16, so if we take that as the break point as to be dying of addiction or alcohol abuse, substance misuse, whatever you want to call it. Morella, do you have a group that actually kind of works with this type of thing, or do you pass people on to specialists?
We usually would pass people on to to specialists. Although it will depend on the individual, I think, and we would assess the situation and then make a decision about what we would do in those circumstances.
Yes, because one of the things is that to my knowledge, there's almost 10% of the population are in one way involved with substance misuse, and that will affect a noticeable number of people around them, all the family, friends, work, everything else. So do you find that there are individual groups like yourself as crews that act as a clearinghouse, is rather a nasty way of saying it, but as a guideline, as a way of finding out information?
You mean information for
where somebody that's been bereaved should go?
Yeah, I mean we would deal with bereavement issues, but when it involves drugs and alcohol, Cruise has recently started to train people so that they will be specifically trained to deal with people who have been bereaved by misuse of drugs or alcohol. So it will be, it will become a sort of a specialist area for us, which would, is a good thing. But up to now, we would deal with clients who'd lost someone through misuse of drugs or alcohol.
Pete, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I'd like to add that one of the organisations that is very useful as a first place to call when somebody is bereaved through drugs and alcohol is an organisation called Drug Fam. They offer immediate support. It's a national organisation that offers support and a telephone line, plus individual and group work support. It was created out of the death of somebody's son, and there is also an organisation that is set up to offer support to young people, which is provided. That support is provided by Drug Fam as well. I'll give you the details. Drug Fam is a very useful organisation.
Okay, we'll come back to details later on. Bob, you work, as far as I understand, as an independent professional service provider. So presumably you get contacted by the larger organisations or through word of mouth and things like that. What about yourself, Alan?
I've worked in different settings. I guess maybe also just to mention how the overlap can work between grief, bereavement and serious mental health problems and disorders, that grief is often a dimension of acute and serious psychiatric problems, so sometimes it gets lost when people are just thinking about illness.
Thank you. Yeah, we're just going to a short back to the JK and the Babbers Show here on Ujima Radio 98 FM. We've been spending the last almost 3/4 of an hour now talking about grief and bereavement, and we've covered a lot of different things there. And we just started talking before the break about this thing that we're working together. And one of the aspects that came up is actually the mental health side, which is being covered last week in this city. And for the whole of this week with the Healthy City Week, there's an awful lot going on throughout the city. You can get diaries from all sorts of local offices. I've seen it everywhere, from council offices to tourist offices to everywhere, as to what's on each day. There's lots of interesting talks, the complete days to do with how to use nature and therapy and things like that. And one of the things that briefly was mentioned before is this thing that how closely tied up a lot of the aspects of bereavement are also tied up with the aspects of mental health before the bereavement. Pete, you kind of got something to say on that, I think.
Yes, I think through my work in a number of settings, so Bristol Drug Project as a drug worker and various other settings, I think one of the things we see is the use of the opportunity to spend time in nature. I think challenges people's perspective of the world. I think it opens it up. It allows them to think about other possibilities than the daily grind, the daily experience that often has become a very miserable experience, but is never ending. And somehow that opportunity to walk out into a wood or a forest or a farm opens their eyes. It's like a door or a window being opened on the world, and sometimes it's quite a dramatic impact. It challenges, I suppose with depression, for example, people can't see beyond their eyebrows. They're looking down all the time, and then suddenly the world, takes on a bit of colour and interest, and it's quite a dramatic impact sometimes, and we see that.
Yeah, I agree on that. I've kind of taught myself for the last few years that if I'm actually out for a walk, I will actually slow down and look at the butterflies or even a caterpillar crossing the road. Alan, you've got quite a lot of experience in this field of working with nature, and specifically in grief. I do know that you do some activities, whatever you want to call it. Would you mind explaining that a bit?
Well, I guess it's all of our experience when in the natural world, there is life and death. there are cycles, aren't there? The cycles of the year. It's autumn at the moment. We've only got to look around and see what's happening to the trees and the leaves. And, we're creatures like all other creatures. So I think, just to echo the very experience of being in nature, the rhythms of nature, is in itself inherently therapeutic, I would say, and helps us find a deeper connection that sometimes social relationships really don't make sense, but nature can make sense. But you're right, there are some specific ways of using nature that can be particularly helpful. I mean, I guess there are lots of ceremonies, rituals that people naturally do, scattering ashes, having special places, is in most people's experience. So how we use place as a way of remembering, even how we can be lost, not just internally but also externally, wandering in nature can sometimes be very important for people. And finding meaningful rituals or meaningful acts or places using nature. It's got many different mirrors, and that's what I think lots of people find inherently, but sometimes supporting them in that can be important.
Bob, you're a fanatic sailor, I know that, an outdoors person as well as being somebody that I've come across in quite small old-fashioned offices. And do you find that nature, being out to be able to slow down, take the stress out of your life, helps with the aspects of bereavement?
Oh yes, absolutely. It just switches me onto another wavelength, and it switches me onto another wavelength, and I'm in a different mind space altogether, and it doesn't take long to do it either. And what comes to mind when I hear Alan and Pete speaking about using nature is for us to look at other cultures and to see the way they express their grief and their loss. And we might get some clues there about how we might do this ourselves in a healthy and cathartic fashion, I think is the word for me.
Yes, I've noticed it when I've been travelling overseas, noticeably in some cultures there's this, partly it is an event, and you go quite rapidly from the thought of this person having moved on to the thought of a celebration of life in general, both the person that has moved on and the society, the community round that person when they died. Morella, do you find that this is a difference between an individual's and family and things like that to do with nature and celebration and that side of it?
Well, yes. I mean, when somebody comes to us and for support, they will sort of start by telling their story, so to speak, and they will talk about often the ceremony and or what happened, and we often find that when someone's got somewhere to go after a bereavement, like maybe a graveyard or maybe a special place that has been designated. I mean, sometimes people have a bench, don't they, in somewhere, or even in the garden. I mean, we do encourage people to have a special place that they can go to, which will sort of bring them comfort. And often people will go either, as I say, to the grave, or they may go to this special bench. I mean, I recall that one client had created a pond in the garden, and used to go there, and they will talk to the person that they have lost, and it will bring them a great deal of comfort. So sort of outside activities, or an outside place, can bring a great deal of comfort to someone who is grieving. But having mentioned the word outside activities, so can actually physical exercise. You know, when we do talk with our clients about what sort of is they find helpful. And many people will say that physical activity, either walking, running if they're able, maybe swimming, could be playing games, outside games, that they find that it de-stresses them and helps them often to sleep and relax a bit.
Yes. We all seem to be going on the same theme here, is we're all saying about trying to relax, trying to get that immediacy out of it as to where do you get your money from to be able to buy your food having been bereaved. Do you keep the house? Do you slow down using nature? Do you slow down using some activity you like gardening and things like that? Some people have mentioned this idea of maybe you don't want to be told what to do when you're in a grief situation. You want to just get through the experience quietly, maybe somebody just holding your hand, things like that. And we're coming very close to the end of the program here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I suggest that you contact Cruz via the various ways that you can online through various bereavement agencies, Drug Fam, drugs and alcohol services, various social services. There's a lot on this week, and coming up next